growth, learning, well-being has gone through a couple of different stages in my life. So I wanted to talk about those stages and look at those stages and their pros and cons from a couple of different angles. So, leaving school initially at age 14 provides kind of a stage of moving into chaos and preference, because with a very chaotic household and no structure of any kind, which kind of was my life for roughly a year and a half, I found myself drifting into boundarylessness, right? And so there's the initial thought that doing whatever you want when you want to do it has freedom. But I didn't find that freedom to be a freedom that took me where I wanted to go. So I then kind of learned about structure and routine, and I began a protocol of organization. And this kind of was a slow move to the other extreme, which was consciously designing everything. And so that began by creating a routine, which, because I was so disorganized and kind of there was no order around me, had to be a pretty strict routine, because there would be nothing to pull me back on track if I kind of fell off it. So I took it pretty seriously, started with meal times, sleep times, then worked in slowly a routine that eventually, was a typed page that covered things between, every 20 minutes, a distinct shift. For example, I would take a 20-minute nap right after lunch. Then right after waking up, I would write 20 minutes of poetry. And then right after that, a 45-minute kind of reading and exploration period. And so that this was kind of a very structured day. And then I added goals on top of that. First, I did weekly and daily goals. Then I did monthly, weekly, and daily goals. Then I did quarterly, monthly, weekly, and daily goals. And then I went up to yearly, quarterly, monthly, weekly, and daily goals, reviewing them and going that. So now we had incredible productivity, 400% acceleration in meaningful accomplishment, a clear sense of focus at any given point, strong sense of flow, my body attuned to this cycle, tremendous productivity and awareness, yoga for 20 minutes, dream recall for 20 minutes, etc. Then this kind of broke down around a visionary experience around giving my work as a gift. So I had a visionary experience. I wanted to give my work as a gift, but nobody understood it. Nobody appreciated it. Everyone related to this gift in their head. It didn't have any of the emotional impact that it had in the vision. And so it was disappointing. And everyone paid me 50% of what they had paid me before. So I became, I wanted to kind of stay focused on that. So I eventually lived in my car because I couldn't afford rent with the gift exchange framework that I was using. So that this left me feeling somewhat disorganized and disoriented, and led into some compulsive eating. And I didn't know how to deal with that, right? I would now say that it was traumatically triggering to have so little structure and so much uncertainty, and to be more committed to a visionary ideal than to my own survival, right? And so that's kind of brought up, I think, a counter mode where, some part of me feels unsafe, unstable, and kind of wants to eat. So I weaned my way off that by banishing spirituality for a bit and just focusing on discipline, right? Because if spirituality is going to create visions that are going to lead me into traumatic no man's land, who needs spirituality, right? So, so I kind of got back and began raising my, growing my business, I would say, was the next phase. I'm going to really grow my business. And that worked very well, right? So I learned new skills. I bought heavy equipment. I did a great job growing my business. And eventually became a general contractor, built my first house at age 23, built a second house at age 25, sold my first house very profitably, et cetera. And so, now I'm kind of focusing on almost as a defense against not understanding what all is going inside, a certain amount of workaholism, to just stay focused on moving forward, making money, etc. Then at age 26, I met kind of my first serious romantic partner. And, that moved me towards exploring relationship and also more deeply into the Lazarus material. So kind of parallel to this, I got interested in metaphysics and philosophy at age 12 and kind of explored it extensively with the Lazarus material during the time of structures and goals. And so that was part of my routine. Let it go a bit, during the time I was living out of my car, and then got a little bit more interested, actually met my first romantic relationship, at a Lazarus event. And she'd been working, and so Lazarus is a channeled entity, so she'd been working with Lazarus for about 20 years. And this also was a certain introduction into how ineffectual the Lazarus techniques were in the domain of relationship. And so we kind of, using a hammer, the Lazarus for everything, all the nails and not nails, right? We tried to apply the Lazarus techniques. They didn't work. Created difficulty and eventually a separation in the relationship. At this point, I began experiential workshops on communication and relationships that were very practical. And you'd practice exercises together. And this was an eye-opener. And it did a number of things because it worked so well, and because it was in many ways the opposite of the Lazarus material, and because I had lived, for a year or so, I lived for a decade or so in kind of this little bubble where Lazarus was, the great teacher, the great, the goal, right? People would tell me that I'd, found the best teacher, etc. And I thought, this is incredible. Not only did the Lazarus techniques not work in this domain of relationship, and in some cases make things worse, but these are so much easier, are so much more fun, so much more effective. What's this, right? And so there's a certain shattering of the bubble. Like I've been living in this paradigm where channeled material is supposed to be the be-all and end-all. And then I'm getting all this data saying that it isn't, right? That, unevolved human beings with a little basic psychological literacy are teaching far better techniques in a much more enjoyable way. It's more enjoyable to sit in a small circle with 5 people and explore this topic and that topic than it is to have a monologue with 500 people silently taking notes and not interacting. It's not only more effective, it's more enjoyable. The techniques are more effective, and the protocol of delivering the techniques is 10 times more useful and fun, right? So this is kind of breaking a little bit of the mold for the second time, because the first time was leaving Christianity and all of its dogmas and fears and judgments and hypocrisies and absurdities to explore metaphysics in the Lazarus terrain, which is heretical in a lot of Christian circles. So I left Christianity to explore Lazarus, and then I left Lazarus to explore experiential workshops based on what worked with human beings, and each of these were steps forward. However, then the growth curve of the experiential workshops tapered off. Like, there was a very high learning curve, and so there was a lot of improvement in like the first 6 months. But then for the next 10 years, it largely plateaued, right? It's going up a little bit, and some of it's getting worse, right? Because there's some of the newness gone, and it becomes more repetitious, more hedonic adaptation. I also went from being largely alone to very interested in, all that was possible in romantic relationships. But that was kind of a whole stage. And then, that was kind of blown up or, concluded to some extent when one of the facilitators at the workshops sexually abused me, 2 times during a therapeutic session, in a very confusing way that again told me that, I didn't know what I was doing and didn't know what I didn't know. And then that whole community, basically to protect itself legally from, a very strong record of illegal, unethical activity, tried to bury me in order to protect the secrets of the facilitator, which it turns out is relatively common. 12% of therapists confess in anonymous surveys to having sexual relationships with some of their clients. And the trouble is that 99% of the time that is not good for the client. It may or may not be good for the therapist, but it's certainly not good for the client, right? And so, that's so that's, that kind of shattered that world. And then being buried, having my email accounts disconnected, et cetera, because, it's all about love and well-being and a world where everyone wins until the student or the therapeutic client, their win is to be seen, right, in this area, right? It's one of the biggest troubles with taboos is not the taboo itself that's there, but it is the insanity, right? When a teacher who's teaching openness and love betrays, their spouse, the law, the, ethical guidelines, and then talks about the need for secrecy, you're asked to go crazy. You're also asked to pay someone to teach you to go crazy, right? So so there's a tremendous, when you enter these taboo terrains, the way that people deal with them is often more destructive than the taboo itself, right? The limited sexual activity in the therapeutic session was minuscule compared to the amount of confusion, the amount of hypocrisy, the amount of isolation, the amount of shame, the amount of fear that, gets directed at, in this case me, but to someone that is a truth teller in a shadow area. And it's no different in government. I mean, government stealing this, doing that, whatever, etc. But the amount of hostility to have an entire government using its energy to silence a citizen, it's an enormously overwhelming experience. And so this precipitated PTSD, which it turned out I knew nothing about. And then that led to another, a whole journey of learning about PTSD. This also took me, very deeply, into helplessness, into terror, into hatred, into, a sense of being very small and being a victim. And, then, that moved into kind of witnessing that. And, I would say that now the growth is coming from microdosing, psychedelics, making integrative videos of this nature to kind of looking at patterns, learning on Audible, the various perspectives, etc. And, going from up to 3 therapists a week for several years, like 6 hours of therapy a week, to kind of just track and talk about, all the varying levels of, insanity that I was dealing with or witnessing. There's a tremendous amount of disintegration of insanity, and there's no place in the cult to sort all that out. And so even though the therapists in many cases weren't very useful, they had to sit there and listen as I tried to sort things out. And it would have been nice if, there was a little bit more input, but at the very least, before I had videos like this to kind of talk things through, I could talk things through to another person and see if they got it or not. So, that, and then that, that whole PTSD wave, et cetera, took me into, a deep state of fatigue and exhaustion, and pain and grief, as I was kind of exploring the kind of traumatic abuse cycles in the present moment. I mean, it's profoundly unethical to further harm a therapeutic client in order to protect the reputation of a sexual abuser. And that's the norm in circles in our cult where someone who has a position of leadership or power, whether it's Catholic priests or government officials or media officials, that is the norm. Whether you look at Jeffrey Epstein or Harvey Weinstein, if you have a useful role for people, particularly making them money, there's a whole protection agency that kind of comes in, and it's all about disempowering the victim, the abuse recipient, in order to protect the interests of people in a much stronger position, right? So, this is incredibly wrong, and, going into that and sorting out what to do with how awful that feels. So this then led me into growing through nonprofit, wanting to do something about it. And so that kind of brings me up to the present moment where I've now kind of, after somewhat dismissing Eckhart Tolle as, a lot of focus on the now when goals have, goals about the future and planning and organizing and strategy has worked very well, to a point where, there's a certain way that being in the present and doing breath work transcends the misery of the traumatized, broken, and lonely identity, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. So I would say that my identity has been getting sicker in some ways, going through my 30s, from about maybe 38 to, the present day, a very big dive in terms of just nothing working, trying this. And what's so disturbing is that the good things aren't working, right? The normal thing works, mediocrity works, but every time I would try to really diverge from the norm with another person and do something excellent, I was fought. And that somewhat continues to the present day, but there's this tremendous thing of, why are we ganging up on intelligence? Why are we ganging up on excellence? Why are we ganging up on integrity? Right? And that's a very painful experience for me, to realize that if I do something absolutely outstanding, that is absolutely pivotal and necessary, I will be all alone and often punished for that in some way. And that's an incredibly heartbreaking pattern to notice. This seems to be the case. I get paid lots of money for doing that isn't very important. I get lots of praise for this that doesn't really matter. As long as I'm willing to kind of fit in, that I get all of this stuff, all this praise, all this sex, all this money, and it's not important. But if I look at what's really important, like traumatic literacy or something like that, it's the opposite. I'm too busy to talk about that. I don't want to know about that. That's not my area. You're a party pooper. I'm certainly not going to pay you anything. And so, this is this has taken some time to make sense of, right? Because having understood just how significant an impact trauma and PTSD, et cetera, is having on the culture, the human thing to do is to bring about more traumatic literacy, and to have that just be kind of brushed aside is a very, very painful, confusing experience, which I'm still kind of sorting out. But and that doesn't lead to to joyful healing, et cetera. It leads to bitterness. It leads to confusion. It leads to frustration. And so now I'm taking a look more at breath work and present moment, because in those states, I'm able to lift out of the loop and charge my body with the energy to do things without the support of other people, per se, right? I can just create and do things with a very beautiful energy from within. And so that's the new learning. That's the new wave right now is, breath work, 30 minutes a day, and lifting out of spiraling thoughts that end nowhere. And what I mean by that is, when understanding how influential trauma is, and what it leads to, the fear of the unknown, the re-triggering, the dissociation and numbness, the inability, all these things. Like, well, if a cult keeps turning away from that while traumatizing its people, then that just grows. And if people that try to do something about it are some way punished and aren't given funding, there's no end in sight. So it becomes, those are the kind of thoughts that then lead down into frustration, into hopelessness. And then when I think, well, what about this, and what about that, and what about this? And when those all are met with resistance or apathy or argument, it's like, this is going to wear me down faster than it's going to lift others up. What do I do there? Well, what do I do, right? See, those are the things that just keep going round and round. So the great shift right now is into presence work and into kind of self-energizing. And so that's where the journey concludes today.